Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are just going to wait just a minute or two to let people kind of filter in, and then we will get started in just a moment here. All right, so we have hit 12 o'clock, so we are going to get started. So first off, I want to say hello and welcome to everyone to today's webinar, 4 Keys to Unlocking Cyber Insurance for Your Organization. My name is Matthew Formisano. I'm a product marketing specialist for our network engineering practice at LBMC Technology Solutions, and I'll be your host today. Thank you to everyone for joining. As we do get started, go ahead and drop your name and location in the chat. As I said, my name is Matthew Formisano, and I'm in our Nashville, Tennessee office. I have just a few housekeeping items to go over before we get started. All lines have been muted to eliminate any background noise. If you experience any technical difficulties, please let us know by using the chat panel. We will be taking questions throughout today's webinar, and we'll answer as many as time allows. So feel free to submit your question at any time. You can do this either in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen or the chat panel. We encourage you to use both the chat and the Q&A features, as there are many attendees registered for today, and you have a captive audience of users from around the country in a variety of industries. You never know. You might be facing a challenge that someone else on here has already been through or solved. Also, we are offering CPE for this event for those of you that are eligible. In order to receive your CPE, you must answer all poll questions. We have a total of 3 today. After today's event, you'll be receiving an email with the slides from today's presentation, the recording, and a survey link. Please fill out the survey. It's very short and it helps us improve any future webinars we do. Also, at the end of the webinar today, we will be drawing a name at random for a $250 gift card, but you must be present to win. Now, without further ado, please help me to welcome our presenters for today's webinar. Joining us, we have Brian Wilton, President of LBMC Technology Solutions. We also have Kelly Pierce, an Enterprise Account Executive at Arctic Wolf Networks. And last but not least, we have Mark Sargent, a Senior Sales Engineer at WatchGuard. Welcome, Brian, Kelly, and Mark, and thank you for presenting today. While this webinar will deal primarily with cybersecurity and cyber insurance, I do want to take just a moment to note we are a full-scale technology company with many different services. Some of them are not even listed here on this slide, and we would love the chance to help you with any tech problem you may experience, no matter how large or small it may seem. And before we fully dive in, I do want to just pop up one quick poll. The first poll: how important is cyber insurance to your overall cybersecurity strategy? We'll leave that up for a couple of moments, and then we will dive into our webinar. Just about 15 more seconds here. All right, I'm going to close the poll. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kelly, because before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to start off by just setting the scene of the cyber landscape today and the current threats that are out there. And Kelly will help us kind of talk through about how that has changed in the last few years.
Hey, thanks for the introduction, Matthew, and pleased to be here. Guys, I think really the main thing driving a lot of what's going on in the cyber insurance industry right now is related directly to cyber risk and what's been happening in general over the last 5 years specifically, and then even longer back to 10 years, right? So like specifically around cyber insurance, when we saw COVID happen and workforces began working remotely, relying more on applications and on their home internet setups and all kinds of different things, we saw a massive increase in the number of claims that insurers were actually seeing. And what that ultimately caused was more pressure on the insurers to tighten their controls and really have a better idea so they can manage their balance sheets of what sort of risk their clients are actually bringing to the table when they cover them under a policy, right? And so this massive spike in claims through COVID was largely due to that massive distribution in the workforce. But even zooming out further than that, over the last 10 years or so, we've been seeing this rise in cyber risk. And that really comes from a couple of key areas. Since, say 2010, there's been no shortage of security companies out in the market. There's over 3,000 in the market today. And there's billions of dollars of spend going into making these tools more effective and better at what they do. The problem, though, is even despite all of that investment, the impact of cybercrime continues to rise, and we're seeing more and more breaches year over year. So there's this effectiveness gap today in the industry where there's a lot of investment going into these tools, but customers aren't receiving the outcomes that they were setting out for, which is ultimately reducing their risk and decreasing the chance of a breach. Ultimately, that comes down to a lot of different areas, but one fundamental gap is really the ability of the human teams behind these tools to actually drive those tools forward and get the most value out of them. And so if we move on to the next slide here, Matthew, this is a similar view, but it really speaks to sort of what's been happening with that. Like, first of all, the cloud came around and killed the perimeter, right? Like the idea of just being able to set up kind of your firewalls and basic edge management stuff to have everything locked down, that simply no longer applies with the cloud being such a critical part of how business is done today. And then COVID and the pandemic really accelerated the explosion of attack surfaces that we see. There are just so many more places where a threat actor could get into your environment today than there were 10 years ago. And so it continues to get more and more sophisticated. At the same time, cybercrime has continued to develop and become a legitimately big business. There is no shortage of ransomware groups that, the FBI will take one down tomorrow, and then the next day the same actors will reband under a new group, and they'll just keep doing the same things. And this is big business for these folks. They'll be looking actively for zero-day exploits and vulnerabilities that they can tap into, and they leverage AI and machine learning and all kinds of organizational processes to launch these attacks en masse. So any sort of organization can be impacted by cybercrime. It's not always a specific person targeting one company. Rather, it's these massive threat actor groups that are just looking for where they can get into the environment and get leverage to ultimately reach their agenda, and get a ransom or cause business disruption. And so this is really what's been going on in the market as it relates to cyber insurance. As the risk for companies has gone up around cyber security, the risk for the insurers has gone up too. And so particularly the last 4 or 5 years, we're seeing tighter stringency on the controls and more requirements on those questionnaires every year. And so that's part of what we're looking to help address for you guys today is really telling a story around how, between firewalls and multi-factor authentication, different log aggregation and security best practices, how you guys can best get out in front of your insurance renewals, capture financial savings for the business, and ultimately drive your risk profile lower.
Perfect. Thank you for that explanation, Kelly. Next, I want to, jump over to Mark. So Mark, how does multi-factor authentication reduce the risk of cyber breaches and influence those cyber insurance rates?
Great question. So it influences because, as we all know, passwords are no longer enough these days. There's been a ton of well-publicized big breaches where usernames and passwords are compromised, and they're not just actively using them right away. Sometimes those lists sit out on the dark web for years and years and years. And so if you never change your password, if you never change your user ID, it could come back to haunt you much later. So the idea of multi-factor authentication is your password is something you know, MFA is something you have, i.e. the token. And so even if your password and username gets out there, you still have the something you have as the final authentication factor, which will prevent folks from account takeover, breaches, and all that sort of stuff. So that's really what they're looking to get, to verify. It used to be years ago that cyber insurance companies would ask you, do you have MFA? And somebody answered yes on the checklist, that would be good enough. But today, because of this, they're actually saying, show me that you've implemented it, show me that you're using it actively for all of your users. And that's how it then influences your premiums and things like that.
Great. I'm going to come to Brian next. So we've talked a little bit about MFA, and then Kelly kind of laid the groundwork for what you need. But kind of looking at it holistically, how does the integration of MFA, as well as security information and event management, extended detection and response, and a security operations center and firewalls, how do all of those work cohesively to create a robust cybersecurity framework?
Well, that's a good question, Matthew. And it's not one way that's available to protect yourself. And so, back to the password example, passwords aren't enough. There has to be other layers that allow that protection to go deeper. And so, it used to be a few years ago, two-factor authentication was the latest and greatest and sufficient. And now we've kind of moved more to a multi-factor where it's not just two. It could be a password and then a text to your phone, or some application that is on your mobile device that you can authenticate in, and so it's really it's become almost a nuisance because we have to try to stay safe, and those of us that are not bad actors are paying the price for the few that are. But I think it's multiple layers of protection for sure. And I always think of like a bank. So, a bank, when they close for the day, they don't just leave all the money on the counter and in the drawers and so forth, and then walk out and lock the front door. So that's not adequate. And so that's the password thing, is a password's not enough. And so, the bank, they lock the front door, but before they do that, they take the money off the counter and out of the teller's windows, and they put that in the vault. And many times there's a small safe or a vault within the main vault that the actual cash is in. And so, that's very, very common. And so the front door's locked, the vault is locked, and then where the actual cash is stored is inside of another vault or an inner safe within the main vault. And so I think it really is the same concept, Matthew, is all of these things have to be in place and work together to really get us where we need to be.
So I want to follow up with that, and the bank analogy is actually great. So we do have one question that has come in, and it's saying, we are being encouraged to use password banks. Is this really the safer option rather than keeping your passwords in some personally maintained file? Can't the password bank system become hacked?
Well, yeah, if you're asking all three of us, you might get three different answers. But from my viewpoint, generally, yes, a password vault or bank is going to be safer than having a personal, some people keep it in an Excel spreadsheet or in their OneNote, or, heaven forbid, it's written down somewhere. I think the days of putting on the back of your keyboard are kind of gone, thankfully. But any online password storage system is generally going to be thought to be safer than something that we're maintaining ourselves. Now, that said, there are some of those that have had some compromises here of late. And so we found that, they're not completely safe, but I think, you have to do your homework, and there are a number of those out there that have never been breached. And, I'm almost reluctant to even say names because, just because they haven't been breached to date, they might be breached tomorrow type thing. But the good news is within those password systems, those passwords are highly encrypted. And even though there might be access gained into that product or that organization, the actual passwords that we have stored out there theoretically would be encrypted to the level that it would still take an extremely long time to unscramble those and be able to use them, and give us as the end users time to be able to go make changes and so forth. So the other guys might have a totally different take on that, but that's my personal opinion.
If I can just add to that, not a difference, but generally speaking, I think password vaults encourage good password management too, making your passwords, 16 characters long, not reusing passwords. And generally speaking, you have to have a master password, which hopefully you have is a very long with a lot of special characters. And honestly, a lot of password vaults also require MFA to get into them. So there are multiple controls in place for a lot of password vaults, and I would look for things like that as well. But I think the biggest thing from a password vault standpoint is encouraging non-reuse of passwords and complexity and length in passwords.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd really add on to that, guys, like overall, when we're looking at MFA and password management, like everything to do with security requires taking a layered approach, right? I mean, even with, if we're looking at like anybody who's looking to get in through just one lock, like if I'm motivated to get through a gate and all that's stopping me is a padlock, I can find a way through that padlock. But then if I go and open that gate up and there's security on the other side, and then I've got to go through a second door that has a key card I need to swipe, right? Like having different layers and steps there is really critical to having like a good overall security posture. And so all of these things, I would argue, are core requirements around.
So that layered approach may actually kind of play a factor in the second question that we've received. And they're just asking us to cover the carve-outs that insurers are adding to policies, which can negate the aspects of the coverage. They're saying it would be helpful to know kind of what to watch out for when choosing a policy. So the individual businesses and business executives can understand the coverage that they have. We'll start with Kelly and then kind of go back the way we came with then Mark and Brian.
Yeah, so specific to like insurance policies for businesses directly, I don't have a huge amount of expertise around the specific carve-outs for business policies. Where I'm familiar with the carve-outs and language is around some of the new SEC guidelines around disclosure. They're informing a lot of how these insurers are thinking about this. With the SEC guidelines now, they're looking at sort of with their policies that their carve-outs around requirements are around disclosure of events that may extend beyond the scope of just the company and might represent a national security risk. And so I'll defer the direct questions for policies you guys might have to some of the other folks on this call, because I don't have as much direct familiarity with that specific topic.
Yeah, I'll just add that I'm not an insurance guy either. I'm a security guy, but I do know, like I mentioned, that a lot of them have required MFA for a long time, but now they're actually wanting to see it. So I think it's no longer good enough to just put a check in the box. You have to actually prove that you're doing these types of controls in your environment to be able to qualify. And so if you're lying about it and you're caught later, then that would obviously negate coverage, and insurance companies aren't in the game to lose money.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt about that one. I think, Matthew, what I've seen is the insurers, they really expect the organizations to do their part in this. And so they're not just going to write a policy and then make a payment if there's a claim, if the company's done nothing to try to protect themselves. And so, I think a lot of that internal protection is education of the employees and the team, that they know not to click on, rogue emails that might have something enticing in there. And it's not just to say they've done it. Back to Mark's point about checking the box is, have some education and document that, and know that every person in that organization has had to take those training sessions and has gone through the you know, testing or quizzing or whatever are built into that learning model. I think they have to be able to prove that they've done everything they possibly can to protect themselves, and the common things like the multi-factor authentication, or, you know, lock the server room type thing, you know, offsite backups, and having the right firewalls in place. And so the companies, the organizations have to do as much as they can, and then the insurance kind of picks up from that point. So that's what I've seen.
That's very helpful. So I want to jump back to Kelly now. Brian gave us the holistic view, but kind of getting into more specifics. Kelly, would you be able to explain the role of SIEM, Security, Information and Event Management, and XDR, Extended Detection and Response, in meeting those insurance policy requirements?
Yeah, sure thing, Matthew. So really, when we're looking at SIEM and XDR and how they support your cyber insurance controls, it's really being driven from one core thing, and that's that before SIEM and XDR, there's so many different tools that are required to run an environment for an effective security posture. We're talking about MFA, we're talking about your EDR, we're talking about dozens of other potential security tools. The challenge with this that folks have been experiencing as the attack surfaces continue to expand is that now so many people are managing dozens of different tools, and to look at the alerts from those and to be able to actually act on them, notice them when we see threat activity, and have them all up in 12 different softwares and 12 different panes of glass, that becomes operationally nearly impossible to actually see all of those threats and act on them all at once. And so the role of a SIEM really primarily is to serve as a log aggregator, to bring all of the relevant security logs into one central place so they can be managed all together, and you can see the whole picture at once instead of having to click into a bunch of different tabs and go through a bunch of different UIs to actually see what's happening in your environment. Now, the challenge that folks run into, and where we get into the delineation between whether a SIEM or an XDR is the right fit for you, either one of them will fulfill log aggregation requirements that we're seeing more commonly in cyber insurance renewals. The challenge that some small businesses and mid-market businesses, generally anybody that doesn't have a really deep IT bench, is that running a SIEM can be a very cumbersome task, right? It requires a lot of work to actually get it running. For like a large enterprise, Fortune 500 company that has 50 to 100 security staff running it, a SIEM is going to be a great tool to give them finite control of how they actually want to operationalize their security data. The challenge for a smaller company is that to effectively stand up and deploy a SIEM, first you need to get all the logs fed in by tons of different ways to do that. You're pulling it in by API, sometimes you write a custom API, sometimes with a syslog, sometimes an S3 bucket, sometimes we're going to pull that directly via some sort of hardware, but that all takes time to set up. And then even once the logs are being fed into the SIEM, then you have to tune the SIEM to actually look for the right things and look for the right events. Because now that the data is going into it, the SIEM is ingesting massive amounts of log data, just raw log data, and it's looking for anomalous activity. So then you have to tune the SIEM to teach it what to look for. Then you have to write correlations across the different attack surfaces so that you can understand, hey, we're seeing this alert from our Office 365, and then we're also seeing this alert from our EDR. On their own, neither one of these looks like potentially bad, but when we put them together and look at the lateral movement, that indicates threat activity. That is something that you have to go and proactively write into your SIEM with configuration and rules and correlations. All of that takes a lot of time and expertise and manpower to stand up. And so the alternative for other organizations to be working with a vendor that provides MDR services delivered through an XDR platform. The utility on this is that they tend to be much more turnkey. The vendors bring the integrations to the table already, so they have them pre-built, and they'll have teams to support getting that fed into there. And then from a log ingestion, events per second, like the pricing model is typically much more flat on an XDR, where for a SIEM, the more data you feed into it, the more cost you accrue. With an XDR, it's typically a flat cost you see associated with it. So they fulfill the same utility when it comes to cyber insurance and security risk reduction. And it really is a matter of what fits best for your organization. Highly resourced organizations that have a lot of security expertise can often get value in fine-tuning and configuring a SIEM. And organizations that are looking for a more turnkey approach typically benefit more from an XDR platform.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Kelly. We're going to pause very quickly right now just for our second poll. I can bring it up. All right. Our second poll question is, while the tools we've been speaking about today, it's not an all-encompassing list of what you should have or may need to obtain for cybersecurity insurance. They are essential when thinking about your organization. How many cybersecurity tools do you currently have? I will leave that up for another 15, 20 seconds or so, and then we will move on. All right, I'm going to be closing the poll in about 5 seconds. All right. Next, I want to go to Mark. So, Mark, we've talked about a couple things, and most recently, Kelly was kind of mentioning when he was talking about the SIEM and the XDR, talked about firewalls as well, and I think that was kind of mentioned as like a perimeter defense. So, specifically, how do firewalls contribute to an organization's eligibility regarding cyber insurance coverage?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. That's a great question. And I think it's not so much the firewalls, because today, firewalls obviously have evolved over the last 25, 30 years. They started out as, simple packet filters with rules that said, I'll allow this traffic from this IP address on this port and things like that. So it kind of gated it from there. But we all know that that is in and of itself not enough. So it's really more about the services that are wrapped around the firewall. Do you have content filtering? Do you have intrusion prevention? Are you performing some sort of gateway antivirus so that when somebody's downloading something from the internet, that it will scan it through, gateway antivirus or something like that? It also really provides that VPN termination endpoint for remote users. We talked about, and Kelly mentioned that, post-COVID, people are still working remotely. The attack surfaces has changed. So when people are VPNing in, are they also subject to those same kind of rules? And even beyond any of the services and things on that, the most basic, and maybe this doesn't necessarily influence cyber insurance, but the most basic prevention is good segmentation in your internal network, in terms of, making your IoT devices on one network, making your different departments on your server farms, and then having them processed through the services that are on the firewall. So I think really it's about the services and about the setup in the firewall that ultimately are going to influence a policy.
Great. Brian, I'm going to come to you next. We've talked a lot about kind of why you need certain tools and kind of how that impacts your cyber insurance. But I kind of want to talk about some of the common misconceptions around cyber insurance that organizations should be aware of.
Yeah, well, I think a big one is some organizations think they don't need it. The mentality sometimes is, well, nobody cares about us. We're not some big Fortune 1,000, 5,000 company, and no one's going to come after us and try to breach our systems. And so they have this mentality of, we're not, we don't see any of those threats out there. The other one kind of along with that is business owners or executives saying, oh, our systems are totally locked down, we're completely safe. We would never have anyone intrude into our network. And of course, all those are completely false. And so you don't have to be Exxon or the largest of the large to be hacked. And a lot of times it is smaller companies. The big ones make the news, so that's the one. Those are the ones we hear about. and get our attention. But for every big one, there's many, many more little ones, kind of the mid-size, small to medium business groups that are out there. Those are very attractive to hackers, and sometimes they are easier because they have this false sense of security that that nobody cares about them, and if they did, that they're completely locked down. I saw something here, a survey just a couple of months ago, and the current rate of cyber attack occurring is every 40 seconds. So that means every 40 seconds a cyber attack occurs somewhere in the world. And so, I think with that, there's no one that really should feel like that they're safe or they're not attractive to the bad actors out there.
Yeah, I would just add on to that too, Brian. Like, I think when we're looking at that general idea of that sense of security, that, hey, I don't have anything sensitive to protect against, why would anybody want to hack me?
Yeah.
Sometimes that might be true, right?
Mhm.
Might be running a business that we're doing like self-storage, or we're building like lockers, and it's like, well, why did anybody hack me? Like, I don't have anything to steal. Yeah, 100%, that makes perfect sense. But every business has, potential loss of downtime, revenue, brand impact to your contracts you have with your customers. Like, all of those things create leverage for a threat actor, and these are criminals. They're just looking to look for leverage that they can exploit for financial gain. And I think, like, the thing I would add that I want to highlight on that in particular is there's two types of companies out there today. There's the ones that have been hacked and the ones that haven't yet. And that's just the way that things are today. When we look at kind of the proliferation of ransomware as a service, there are all these massive criminal enterprises that they're leveraging AI and machine learning tools and hundreds of hackers and engineers that they're just going through and they're looking for known vulnerabilities. Over 80% of successful ransomware attacks today are happening from known patchable vulnerabilities. It's not a sophisticated zero-day exploit or a genius hacker looking specifically at your environment and how he can get in. It's oftentimes this programmatic system of like finding businesses and then launching attacks on them for known vulnerabilities. And it's folks that aren't keeping up with their cyber hygiene, that aren't aware of these vulnerabilities and don't have the monitoring systems in place to catch when they're looking to be exploited. That's when it ends up going down, right? So, we see it all the time for what we do in our work. Like, there's so many folks that don't feel the impact of that, don't feel they're at risk. And it's a shame that sometimes it's until something happens, or something happens to a colleague or something else, that then they understand that. So I want to reiterate that and just share it. It's not about a specific person or information. It's about the nature of the business gain from it, from the threat actor.
It's great. And that stat, Brian, that you gave of every 40 seconds is truly scary.
It is. I mean, there's a lot of businesses out there, and 40 seconds is not much time ticking through the clock. And some of these attacks, it's not that the attackers are actually after that sensitive information, which may not be there, as Kelly said. A lot of times they just do it to see if they can do it. And they'll take a challenge to breach a system just to see if it can be breached. And if it can, then okay, well, maybe we can put some dollars on this or some Bitcoin on this and make a little money to hand it back to them. So it's, the mind of a criminal is different than most of us on this meeting today. And so you can't really rationalize why people do what they do.
Very true. Very true. We've got another question from the audience. We'll start with Mark, and then kind of Brian, Kelly, if you want to chime in after. This question is asking, do cyber insurance companies measure risk based on the attractiveness of the company seeking insurance? And if so, how is that measured?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would assume so. Again, not being an insurance expert per se, I would assume so. Obviously, if you're you're one of the Fortune 500s, you're very attractive, and so Your insurance policies are probably much more. But I would, again, go back to, if they're looking to get cybersecurity insurance, they probably have a checklist of things that are required, MFA, firewall, all of those things. Those things are not going to differentiate, from a big company to a small company. Maybe their revenue might cause their policy to go up, their gross revenue and things like that. But I think the basics are always going to be there as requirements.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Mark. I think, there are some high profile companies or organizations around that, take something like Disney. There's probably not a lot of sensitive data that would be available to hackers, although I don't know that, there might be, but just, to cause embarrassment in companies that have what we would say pretty deep pockets to pay that ransom if they so choose to do so. I think they're attractive to the bad actors. I think organizations like the IRS, that's pretty attractive because they have a lot of data that's very personal to all of us. And so I think there is some delineation between the insurance carriers on, they generally wouldn't share exactly what the formula is, but I do think that there's got to be something that there's some factor in there for the attractiveness of an organization and the susceptibility of the bad actors going after them. So what that is, I don't know, but I'm sure there's some weighting to that when they create the policies.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say there certainly is some weighting to that. And I'll preface everything I'm saying by kind of echoing Mark's sentiment. Like, I'm not an insurance salesperson, I'm not an insurance broker. This is the perspective of a security professional speaking on it. That said, we do work with a lot of folks who are directly adjacent to cyber insurance, and some folks on our team came from companies like Travelers, where they worked on underwriting risk policies for customers. And so we have a pretty firm understanding on like how these insurers look to quantify risk. The attractiveness of somebody as like a victim is one of those things, and they'll look at that in a bunch of different ways, right? Like when these underwriters are going through and looking at your policies, they're looking at a bunch of different factors around the revenue of the business, the industry, the size of the organization, right? The nature of their workers, so many different things that's around the organizational setup. But then they're also looking into more specifically the controls in their IT environment, right? How's their network architected? What tools do they have in place? And then the layer deeper than that is after you get to the checkbox of what tools do they have in place, it's what services are operationalized around that, whether internal or through a third party, right? Like what operationally are you doing with those tools? So there is a very sophisticated, like every underwriter is going to do it different, have a different method, but there's a lot of different factors around just the business, the industry, the scope that they go into looking at, measuring and quantifying that risk.
One thing that always kind of gets talked about whenever you're buying a new software or a new security solution, it is cost. And so I want to kind of get everyone's thought on this. Kelly, we'll start with you. How can those smaller and medium-sized businesses balance the cost of cybersecurity measures and the tools that they need to implement to acquire that with the benefits of having cyber insurance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's top of mind for anybody when we're looking at budgeting season or evaluating new cybersecurity tools or anything. And it really comes down to, I think that the thing that I would call out is there's a thought from a lot of folks in leadership that often aren't directly tied to IT, that a lot of people still think of IT as a cost center, right? Just in general, right? This is just something I have to throw money at this to make my business work. I would argue that we're getting to the point in the security landscape right now that we need to start thinking around cybersecurity operations as like revenue protection rather than a direct cost center, right? Looking at the overall risk profile of the organization. If we look at, just for like a brief thought exercise on this, right? The percentage likelihood of any business across all segments having a ransomware event occur within a year is about 9%. right? So let's round it up to 10%, and let's take that out over a 10-year period. Odds are every business is going to have some sort of a ransomware event in a 10-year period, right? And then so the average cost of a ransomware event for a small business, if we look at, like, we'll pull from IBM's reports, for example, it's around $5 million all in. When you look at the cost of lost revenue, downtime, credit monitoring, legal fees, everything adds up. It adds up to around $5 million per ransomware event. So then breaking that down to, you know, over an annual cost, we're looking at $500,000 a year of cost going into that. Comparing that to spending $100,000, $200,000 on making sure that doesn't happen, protecting the continuity of the business. You know, when we extrapolate that out and look at the overall gain, that would be then a factor that actually protects revenue rather than being a direct cost center. So I think it has to be a conversation around risk, and rather than thinking about cost, thinking of the investment in, you know, protecting the uptime of the company, the integrity of the customer data, and other items. But a lot of ways we could go with that. I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts here too.
Start with Mark and then hear from Brian.
Yeah, it's a great point, Kelly. Is my 25 years in IT, I've always, you know, wondered why we were thought of as an expense and not an operational cost, because obviously as everything's getting more and more automated, there's more pressure put on IT staffs and things like that. And again, the whole idea is that, like you said, you know, in the next 10 years, you're probably going to have some sort of event. But I think everybody rationalizes the expenditure or lack of expenditure by saying, oh, they wouldn't want to hack me. And a little bit of a real world example is the church that my mom goes to. As the resident IT guy in my family, my mom was asking me some questions a while ago, and I was giving her some suggestions on what to do and everything. And the folks on the church council came back and they said, well, we don't need to do that, because why would they want me? And I said to my mom, well, how much is the data that they have on the parishioners, their addresses, their phone numbers? How much is that data worth if they can't have access to it for a period of time? And that really is one of the questions that I pose to a lot of people is, what is your data worth if you can't access it for a week, 2 weeks, or never again because it costs too much to pay back the ransom and you have to rebuild or something like that. So that's kind of the mindset, and not, I'm no longer, you know, I'm not one that's going to be hacked, or nobody's wanting to come after my business.
Yep, I would agree with all that. Yeah, it's not, you know, I hate to say it, but it's not if it's going to happen, it's just when and how you're going to respond to it, I think. So that's really the question that we ask clients.
One thing I'd add to, like, with the overall picture of this, right, is like the main thing is like just with the way that the landscape is today, it's likely that something will happen eventually, right? Other ways that we can approach the conversation from an investment financial standpoint to leadership teams is looking at like operational efficiencies, for example, right? Like this is going to be very case by case, and it's going to depend so much on, you know, what every individual business has going on. But, you know, we see a lot of folks every day that maybe they've gone and deployed a SIEM that is sitting there and accruing ingestion charges, but they're not really getting legitimate security value out of it. Maybe they have 2 people that are spending half their day watching that. But then if, you know, so many of these folks, they have these tools in place, but they're not doing the job effectively because they have other shared responsibilities. They have other responsibilities in IT that are not related to security. And so that says then, like, if you have maybe 20% coverage of these tools, well, 80% of the time there's no coverage and you're at risk. So what's the point then of spending all that money for those tools and that salary cost to perform that task when it's not actually effective? Then we look at, you know, there's a case to be made around operational efficiency and actually getting the risk mitigation that you were after in the first place. And so it really is, it's case by case. But I think the end of the day, the message has to be around risk transfer and risk mitigation.
Great. We've got another question from the audience, and I know that as Kelly and Mark and Brian have prefaced, not being underwriters or insurance agents, but this person is asking if anyone could provide kind of just a general counsel for companies that have all SaaS systems in place for all business processes. So they have no on-premise applications and no data on-premise either. Let's start with Kelly on this one.
Yeah, with ones like that, I think, there's a couple different areas. One, it's not much different than, if you're running a more traditional setup, and that a lot of it's going to be around patching hygiene, right? And making sure that you're up to date on your patches on all of your SaaS applications. The other one would be, right, if you're heavy leveraging like an Office 365 or GCP or something like that for those, investing in the security tools and that are available within that. Right, like monitoring that for vulnerabilities and ensuring that things are set up in such a way that there are checks and balances. But I think for SaaS heavy organizations, a lot of it today is going to be around vendor management, patch management, and then there's a conversation to be had around screening of SaaS vendors, right? And looking around kind of their security credibility. If you're looking at big SaaS players, they're usually going to be pretty up to par in that regard. But I think a lot of it's going to be around vendor management and patch management for those organizations, and just keeping a tight grip on that.
I'll add on a couple of things. Most SaaS vendors nowadays support MFA in some way, shape, or form. So making sure that you have MFA enabled, set up for all of your users, your admin users, your regular users. But there still is going to be an endpoint. Even though they don't have any servers or data stored on premise, they're still going to have an endpoint, and that is an attack surface that could be exploited. So making sure you have some sort of EDR, you still need to have some sort of password management and things like that, because if somebody takes over and leverages that endpoint, they could potentially then capture usernames and passwords and have a direct avenue of access into that SaaS application. So there's still a lot of things to look at. It's just that your attack surface is now in the cloud as well as the endpoint instead of internally.
Yep. And I agree with all that, Matthew. We don't really treat that any differently than if everybody had servers all on-prem. We still approach it virtually the same way. And to Mark's comment, there's a little different, spots that we might work to protect, but we still treat it the same.
Great. This is another question for everyone. We'll start with Mark and then go to Brian and then Kelly. And I think we may have a slew of different answers. But how frequently should an organization review and update its cyber insurance policy?
Oh, that's a great question. I think at least once a year. I would assume that they're probably having a mandatory annual review with whoever their agent is and things like that. But I think at the same time that you're reviewing that, you should be auditing your internal processes, your internal attack surface, your one of the things in my role that drives me crazy is nobody ever audits their firewall and their firewall rules, and things change. Things change all the time. You might move from have an on-premise application and now it's moved to a SaaS application, but you might have those firewall rules still in there that allow access that you do. So doing those types of things, at least on a yearly basis, more often, if you have a bigger organization, would be my answer.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Kelly, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Mark's point, right? Like you're going to have your renewal conversation annually with your agent or your broker, regardless. I think that, like, when I hear this question, I think more about policy and procedure. I'm thinking about like documentation of policy. I'm thinking about like incident response planning policy. I think that with that stuff, it's all about hygiene and consistency, right? Having regular focused attention on it. I would argue that organizations should be having that as part of part of their almost daily operations, right? To have that kind of built in with their policy and procedure checking. I talk to a lot of customers that will say things like, oh, well, who does if there's an incident, who deals with that? Or who's looking at the firewall? Oh, Eric in IT does that. Okay, cool. Eric's been here a long time. He knows everything. But what happens if Eric is sick? What happens if Eric's out on vacation? What happens if Eric moves for another opportunity in his career? It's good to have a person who's read into that, knowledgeable about it, but really to scale and have that be effective, you need to have policy and procedure informing what Eric's doing, not Eric doing it, right? So I would argue on at least a quarterly basis, folks should be looking at, reviewing, and updating their remote incident response plan, their policy and procedure, which is all going to be dependent on the nature of your business and your regulatory concerns. But I would argue that that should be kind of a core function as like a daily chug to have that kind of built into the culture of the organization.
Great. We've got time probably for one more question before we start our wrap up. This one I will pose again to the panel. So kind of looking forward, what future trends in cyber threats should organizations prepare for to ensure continued insurance coverage? Let's start with Kelly, then go to Brian, and then Mark.
Yeah, I mean, in the big picture, right, risk is going to continue to rise. And the more risk there is, the more stringency there will be on these insurance controls and these renewals. So I think like a lot of folks over the last 5 years, people have kind of made the joke that cyber insurance renewals it's like, which acronym, which alphabet soup are they looking at this year? Like it was EDR for a long time, then MFA was the big focus. And the buzz that we're hearing around almost like from most folks in the industry right now is that MDR is the next one that'll be like the big requirement. We're already seeing a lot of requirements around log aggregation and asset inventory and control. We're seeing more and more scrutiny now and actually having 24/7 monitoring of those systems. So this fits into some of what Mark mentioned earlier around kind of the services wrapped around these tools. Is the first layer with every iteration of these new tools they're focusing on. The first layer is going to be, do you have the tool in place? That the underwriters are going to ask is, do you have it in place? And then the second question is going to be, what are you doing with it? What are the operations around it? Who's monitoring that? How are you getting the most out of it? So MDR is likely the next 3-letter acronym that you'll see on a lot of your renewals. And then I'm keen to see for the next 5 years as this develops, kind of how AI will continue to play in to the cybersecurity landscape. Obviously, it's been around in security for almost 2 decades now. It's just much more salient now. But the advent of the current state of AI introduces a lot of new opportunities for threat actors to leverage new techniques, and also for vendors and service providers to leverage new defensive techniques. So be keen to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think that was my top one, Matthew, is AI, and we don't know what we don't know yet, and it's certain that the bad folks out there are going to find ways to use it for their causes. Even though there's a lot of good in AI, there can be an equal, if not a greater amount of bad that comes out of it, and voice mimicking and so forth to get transactions approved through banking systems, or you've got a family member being held for ransom somewhere, and you've got the sound of their voice to try to extract money from people back home. And so I think there's a real kind of dark hole there for me on what AI can be used, how it can be used against us. And so I think that's the big thing. And I just don't think anybody really knows yet what that looks like. But I think that's the insurance companies, I think, will be all over that, and either limiting the coverage that they offer around that until everybody gets their arms around it better, or excluding AI type attacks, which hopefully it doesn't come to that there's no coverage for that, because I do see that as kind of being the next big threat on the planet, is using that into artificial intelligence to easily breach systems that are out there.
Yeah, and Brian kind of said it, you don't know what you don't know, and I think that goes for everybody. So IT security professionals, yeah, they can do all the training in the world, they can keep up to speed, but you don't know what you don't know. So to that end, I think periodically getting a third-party vulnerability assessment, having somebody else come in, either, you know, a penetration test externally or internally to kind of tell you, hey, these are new things that are out there and this is what I found. But in conjunction with that, I think a big, very important piece is continuous end user internal training for anti-phishing, anti-social engineering, because as Brian said, AI is now taking advantage of those types of things and making themselves sound like somebody else, or formatting an email that sounds like it's coming from the CEO. So continuous training and risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, penetration testing would be kind of my top things to stay on top of things.
And I guess to kind of tie this up, put a bow on it, I think like the emphasis with AI is that we don't know what we don't know right now about where it's going to go. And this could lead to any sort of kind of threats. And I think that's exactly why we're going to see more MDR, more 24/7 monitoring requirements on insurance renewals going forward, because we don't know where it's going to be, right? We need to have people monitoring this stuff and reacting to threats in real time, because it can be any place, anytime. And I think insurers are going to be looking more and more for folks to have eyes on glass, monitoring for those threats all the time.
Those are all great answers. I appreciate that. All right, before we fully wrap, I've got our third and final poll. As part of attending the webinar, we want to extend a free offer to you, a virtual lunch and learn, where you will have lunch delivered to your place of work. And during that, we would love to learn all about your organization and your current stance on cybersecurity insurance. So I will leave this poll up for just a little bit longer, and then we will kick it back to Kelly to help wrap us up. About 5 more seconds on the poll. All right, closing it down. So Kelly, I'm gonna kick it back to you and try to throw up a slideshow here. And it is not cooperating.
No worries, Matthew. But I mean, we certainly do appreciate you putting all of this together. And Mark and Brian, appreciate you guys participating on this as well. I feel like this was an awesome discussion. You know, I feel like the biggest point to hit home with this is I'll circle back to what I mentioned earlier, that effective security posture requires a layered, iterative approach, right? So much of this is about having policy, procedure, and consistency in your operations built in. There are like the common checkpoints that we have as far as like the controls folks are looking for. But so much more, we're seeing the importance of actually having the people, the policy, and the operations behind these tools driving them forward. For that reason, that we see from the Arctic Wolf side, what we did with where these numbers are coming from is we polled about 500-600 of our current customers, and we asked them, what insurance savings did you see on your premium before and after Arctic Wolf? And they saw, with the caveat of customers who had MFA, firewalls, and backups deployed, that they're blocking and tackling down, going to the next level and adding an MDR solution and getting the most out of the tools they already had, they're seeing between 5 and 25% savings on their insurance premiums, getting greater overall risk coverage because they've decreased their risk profile, right? So this is introducing financial benefit for the customers, but it's also introducing decrease of risk and decreasing the likelihood anything happens in the first place. So yeah, I would say that with all of these solutions tied together, guys, with the team that we have at LBMC, you know, I think that Brian and his team on a case-by-case basis would be more than happy and more than capable of having a conversation with each of you to determine sort of where would make most sense to invest in now to enhance your risk profile and potentially get after some cyber insurance savings as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian, Kelly, and Mark. It was fantastic. To everyone else on the webinar, first of all, thank you for joining. We covered a lot of content today, and if there are any questions that you think of after today, please reach out to us through our website, or you can send us an email right there on the screen, info@lbmctech.com. It is time for our drawing. I did draw the name Marion, and I apologize if I butcher the last name, Hiott, Hiott. You are our winner. Congratulations. We will be reaching out via email to coordinate getting the gift card to you. As a final reminder, we'll be sending out an email in a couple days with the links to this recording and the presentation, as well as the survey. Again, please complete that survey. And remember, as you assess or reassess your cybersecurity posture and cyber insurance coverage, we are always here to help and more than happy to. Thank you again for attending today's webinar, and we hope you have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.